All right, welcome to John class number 6. We did 4 classes, and then the Easter service, Jesus turns water into wine. That was right on pace with our John class, so that stands for John chapter 6. So if you're watching this and didn't realize that, go back and study John and watch the Easter service. Today we are talking about Jesus clears the temple. Another text which is really important and really much more theologically rich than we tend to think. Let's read our story and let's get into it. It says this. This is the whole text right here, by the way. The story is not a long one, even though Jesus is making a very, very significant point. It says this. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and in the temple courts he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" Clearly, Jesus is making a major theological statement, and they want to know on what authority Jesus is causing all of this ruckus. Not just ruckus. As you'll see in a moment, Jesus is actually interrupting the sacrifices, and they want to know on what authority do you have to interrupt the sacrifices of the temple? Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple that he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he said. Then they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. I love this story. If we're going to begin to understand what's going on, we have to understand a couple things. It's Passover. Number one, the time setting is critical. A lot of Jesus' miracles show up on Passover. Jesus generally is going to be up in the Galilee region, but come the big Jewish festivals, the law requires Jewish men to come down to Jerusalem and celebrate. Jesus does come down all through his ministry and usually makes a big scene. This is early on, and so the crowds don't expect him yet. By the end of 3 years from now in Jesus' ministry, there'll be little references like, "and the crowds were looking for Jesus." Like, no, expect this guy who thinks he's the Messiah to make a big scene. This is Jesus' maybe very first big scene. It's Passover. What's going on? All the Jewish people are required to come to Jerusalem. This is why there's such huge gatherings here. When they come, they're going to celebrate the Passover meal. The whole week is sacred. The whole process is sacred. The sacrifices are sacred. The animals are sacred. You don't have to bring an animal with you to Jerusalem when you come, because all around Jerusalem there are shepherds who are paid to simply raise sacrifice quality animals. Sacrifice quality. If you happen to live far away in Israel and you have to bring your sheep with you, now you have to bring your animals, you have to bring enough food, you have to make sure they don't get hurt because it has to be a perfect lamb. Remember all of those things? So to make it possible, right in the law, God established that they could go to Jerusalem and you could buy an animal there, right? You could buy an animal there. This is where this story gets kind of complicated. So God himself is the one who's going to establish that the Israelites can buy animals in Israel. The animals have to be holy. They have to be perfect. They're going to be cared for. They're going to be washed. They're going to be just right, clean, inspected animals. So you just can't have them wandering all over the city. This is not what happens. What happens is, this is a drawing. This is just my drawing. It's not actual size. This is the Holy of Holies. This is the temple itself right here. This is the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant. This is the holy place. It's got the table of showbread on one side. It's got the big menorah, the light of the world on this side. It's got the table of incense over here. Outside of the temple, you'd have the altar, which is huge, 15 by 15. Here's a big, it's called the sea. It's a giant basin. I believe it's 15 feet across. It would have been standing on the back of a bunch of bronze bulls. Huge. This was a basin for the priests to cleanse themselves, probably sprinkle the animals. And so, altar, the sea for cleansing, menorah, table of showbread, incense. This is the temple. This is outside the temple. And then you would have courts, right? You would have the courts of the Jews, and then you'd have the court of the Gentiles. And then surrounding this is the Temple Mount. All of this area is the Temple Mount. The temple just sits on the Temple Mount. If you go to Israel today, you would see the Temple Mount that Jesus would have cleared the animals out. That's where the Dome of the Rock, that whole giant flat area, the temple would have sat on that area. It's not part of the temple, but it is the courts. Now, if all the Jewish people have to get to Jerusalem for Passover, this is the big one, and they're all going to need a lamb, right? A spotless lamb, a perfect lamb, a lamb that's been cared for and tended, and then they have to sacrifice the animal correctly. They have to have the blood, and they're going to use the blood on the altar. You have maybe in Jesus' day 3 or 4 million Jews who are going to swell into Jerusalem. That's a lot. How long is Passover? Just do the math on the animals. Even if you have one animal per family, right? Not per person, but one animal per family. How many animals are you going to have if you have even the smallest number? 3 million Jews are in Israel. How many lambs and sheep and cattle and doves? Why different animals? The answer for that is, of course, how wealthy you are. So that if you didn't have enough, you could sacrifice other things. You could sacrifice a dove. If you had more, you'd go to cattle. Passover, you're going to sacrifice a lamb on top of those sacrifices. All of that's going to happen in the temple on this altar. This one. This altar is 15 feet by 15 feet. As I understand it, in Jesus' day, in this court right here, you would have 100 priests. 100 priests. And out there in the courts, you would have all the animals, and people would come. They would change their monies from all over the place, and they would turn them into temple coins. With the temple coins, they would then buy the correct animals, and then 100 at a time would come into this court. These priests would sacrifice their animals and collect the blood, and those priests would take the blood up to this altar and put the blood on the altar, and those animals would get cleared out, and 100 more would come in. How many animals have to get sacrificed in this court on Passover before the Sabbath? Remember the Last Supper? It's going into Sabbath. Like, you have to do this all like Thursday, Friday, like on their Thursday, Friday, their Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to accommodate. But this is a 24/7 operation to get people through here, to get all these animals butchered. Where are you going to have these animals? If you have to get them all through here in this one space, where are they going to be? You have to have the herds of animals right here. The people have to come here and buy them. This is not wrong. We tell this story like they are not supposed to. What are they doing with these animals at the temple? No, the animals have to be there. It's required by law. God allows them to change money, to sell these animals, to buy these animals. It's all in the Mosaic law. Not even in tradition. It's in the Mosaic law. What's wrong then? What is Jesus having a fit about? Remember what we've been doing here through the whole book of John. Jesus is coming as a transition. Jesus is coming from the old covenant to the new covenant. He's going to establish a new covenant in his blood, and in the new covenant, I will remember your sins no more. So he is now going to begin to take apart and show why it's time for a new covenant. Why do we need this new covenant? What's wrong with the temple? What's wrong with the priesthood? What's wrong with sacrificing animals? The New Testament is going to develop all of these theologies, right? Hebrews is going to say, the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. This is ridiculous. The Levitical priesthood, the priesthood of Aaron, this could never speak to God for us, because they first have to sacrifice for their own sins. They need their own priests, right? They have the same problem as we have. They have no greater access to God. They don't bring more power in the blood of animals. It doesn't work. The temple was never supposed to be. God cannot be contained. This was the ladder, Jacob's ladder. Bethel. Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob founds Bethel and says, this is the house of God. So long before the law, we already have Melchizedek saying, listen, there's going to be a greater priesthood. Abraham is saved by faith, and Jerusalem and the temple is not the founding of the gate to heaven, rather somewhere else is. Jesus is beginning to dismantle that. When he turns water into wine, the story we did on Easter, he is declaring, listen, I am here to find a new solution to your cleanliness problem. You are unclean, and external washings is not enough. It never was enough. It was only a picture looking forward to this day. This day I am here, and I am here to find a better way to cleanse you than external, pointing forward, right? This is this very next story. If he's going to get rid of external cleansing, this is the external cleansing. You can't get rid of this and keep the rest of this. You have to ceremonially wash before you can offer the sacrifice. You have to offer the sacrifice before you go in here, because you got to take blood in here with you, right? The whole thing, the starting place is here. If he's going to turn water into wine, he better have something planned that can get rid of all of this. So Jesus has this wedding feast. He says, listen, there's going to be a new way, a better cleansing, a thorough cleansing from the inside, not just the outside. And then he shows up at the temple and he chases the animals away. And the money changers. The animals have to be there. They have to be right where they were. There is no other place. This is the only functional way you are going to get maybe 250,000 animals into this one room and get them sacrificed so those people can be right before God and go have their Passover meal. They have to be there, prescribed by God. Jesus isn't saying the way they are doing it is wrong. The animals should be farther away, and if they were farther away, this thing would be fine. No, he's saying, listen, this whole thing is a mess. It's time to ask the question that you should have been asking since Jeremiah wrote it in chapter 31. Listen, how is it going to be possible if for God to remember our sin no more? What, one day we will have finally offered enough sacrifices and he won't remember our sin? No, this is not how it's going to go. One day, he's going to do away with this whole thing, not because he's going to do away with it, but because the pictures are filled. So Jesus gets into this discussion. They know that he's saying this thing is wrong. He's not just saying back those things up, they're too close to the temple. He chases them away and scatters them. Scatters the coin, chases them all off the temple, out of the temple courts. He is interrupting. Many people this Passover maybe likely didn't. If these animals stampeded in any kind of crazy sense, there would have been tens of thousands, if not 100,000 animals that Jesus is scattering. If he actually scatters them through the city, he is interrupting. You're not going to make this time back. Who are you, Jesus, to interrupt the temple sacrifices? What authority can you possibly have to interrupt this thing? Because this is our relation. This is Passover, our relationship with God. This stuff came from Moses himself. What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? Jesus answered, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Of course, this is a riddle. Even the disciples don't get this until Jesus rises from the grave. Like, this makes no sense. Jesus is just starting his ministry. They should have known that when the Messiah came, that everything was going to change, including how we worshiped God. We're going to worship in spirit and truth. We're going to worship a God, and our sin isn't going to be taken into consideration. It won't be remembered anymore. They should have asked some questions here more than, who do you think you are? No, wrong question. So Jesus is going to give them another riddle. Besides the riddle of his actions, he's going to give them this riddle. Destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up. They, of course, think he means this temple. And this temple in the time, Herod's temple in the time of Jesus' day, took 56 years. It's one of the wonders of the world. It's absolutely magnificent. White marble, it shined, it had gold, it had bronze doors. It was magnificent. It would have been spectacular during Passovers. The animals and the sacrifices and the priests all walking around in all of their garb in this amazing temple and the smoke and the lights, and it would have been amazing. Tear it down and I'll build it in 3 days. They, of course, don't understand. They think Jesus is crazy. But notice how Jesus' comment totally fits into what he's doing. He's saying, listen, no, stop all of this. Stop all of this. Now, this is important. You can't stop this. You need each and every piece of this if you are going to have a relationship with God. You must be clean. You must have a sacrifice. You must depend on the provision of God. You must look to God to be the light of the world. You must look to God to be the answer to your prayers, and, of course, the very presence of God, the mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant. You need all of these pieces to be in the presence of God. Tear it down, Jesus says. But he doesn't just say, tear this down. He says, and I will give you something new in 3 days. This is going to be replaced, this whole thing, with my sacrifice, with my death and resurrection, will replace all of this. Because Jesus will make us, with his death and resurrection, he will make us clean. This is his death. He is the light of the world. He is God's provision. This is going to be his discussion in John chapter 6, not class 6. He's going to say, listen, I am the bread from heaven. That's this right here, right? This is the prayers of faith that we offer to God, almost accepting God. This is in the Ark of the Covenant. Our sin is inside the Ark of the Covenant, and on top, the shed blood. God doesn't see our sin. He looks down and sees the mercy seat, which is between the vision of God. Here's Christ, the atonement cover. Romans 3 says that Jesus is the atonement cover, right? A picture of Jesus. And where is our sin? Inside the ark. Jesus isn't saying, just get rid of this. Jesus is in fact saying, to tear this temple down and raise it again in 3 days, this will do away with all this. You won't need these animals anymore. The Messiah is here. The Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world, to take it away. Not to cover it up, not to slowly, day after day, repeated sacrifices, to keep pointing it out. Nope, I'm here to take it away. Tear it down and I will replace all of this with my death and resurrection. This is a wonderful story, and it is the necessary story after he turns water into wine, because that story is all about the cleansing. And he's saying, listen, I'm going to shut down the cleansing. Well, the rest has to go away too. You can't, again, keep this if this is going to get replaced. There isn't just a new way to get clean. There's going to be a new sacrifice, and it's not going to be those animals. It's going to be me. It's going to be me in 3 days. And then I'll raise again, and that process will in fact give you access to God, far greater access in fact than this ever could. All this is unnecessary. It's time for a change. You want to know my authority? My authority to say so is that I am the Messiah, and what I'm telling you is going to happen is that myself, my sacrifice for you on your behalf, will replace all the work of all of this. It's no longer necessary. I declare it as the Messiah that this is no longer. I have zeal for the house of God, but my zeal is this house. It's a beautiful thing. All right, that is John chapter 2. We're in John chapter 2, 13 through 25. That's the story of Jesus clearing the temple. All right, next one's coming up.